Okay, so a week from today we have the exam. And now there's too much microphone assist. It's very finicky. So a week from today is the exam. We have class today, we have class on Thursday, we do not have class on Tuesday. My hope is I will go over material today, and then on Friday, you guys will come with loads and loads of questions, and I will spend the entire time asking questions. But if you don't ask questions, I'll just do new stuff, because that's what I do. But today will be the last day of material that will be on the exam. Let's see if we can get this thing to work. Nothing works. Nothing works, it never does. Okay, so the first thing I want to talk about is learning the math. So for some people, the math is super easy, which is great. If that's you, let it be super easy, and don't let me dissuade you from it being super easy. But for others of you, you've been abused with math early on, and you're having trouble coming to grips with the PTSD and all of that. If that's you, I want to give you a few tips on how to approach it so that you can do it. Right? The kind of thing you should expect to see on the exam is like the stuff that we have for the tutorials. So that test is the kind of thing you should expect to see. Okay? So you should be comfortable doing that. And if you are, you'll be great for this exam. Okay? Now, if you are, great. Life is good. Go on. Do your life. But if you're not, how should you approach it so that you can do it then? Right? And everything in life is super easy once you know it and super hard when you don't. And so that's normal. If you don't, you have to get from where you are to where you know it. So how do you do that? Well, here's my suggestion to you, and this is why I started making the videos against department policy, is that for the people who are not comfortable with the math, what you should do is you should get the video that I did the math for. It says math right in the video title, right? Get yourself a couple sheets of paper, 20 sheets of paper, blank paper, get yourself a pen, and get yourself 2 to 3 hours where you are expecting to do nothing else for that 2 to 3 hours. Learning is always hard. You have to give yourself time to do it. It's not the kind of thing that you just sort of go in and at the end you sort of watch it and then you know it. Right? If you watch it and then you know it, it means that you kind of already knew it and I'm just sort of putting it 2 and 2 together. If you don't know it, you've got to learn it. Learning is always hard. Learning is always time-consuming. You have to expect that. And particularly math is a step-by-step-by-step sort of thing. And so you have to give yourself time and space to learn it. And also, for most of us, it is impossible to really learn it without the pencil and paper. So get yourself pencil and paper, sit yourself down, give yourself 2 to 3 hours where there's nothing else going on in your life or you've pushed it all aside, and then go through the video. And as you go through the video, watch me do a step, pause, and then do exactly that same step on your piece of paper. And ask yourself, do I know, 1, why he's doing this crazy step? What's got into that guy? 2, is that a legal thing to do? How do we know that it's a legal thing to do? Right? And all we're ever going to do in all of these things, except for the brief moment where we saw the natural logarithms, but everything else, what you're responsible for involves adding, subtracting, multiplying, and dividing. There is nothing else there. It's adding, subtracting, multiplying, dividing, and we're doing the same thing to both sides. Okay? So as long as you're doing the same thing to both sides and that thing is a legal thing, you're good to go. And the only time you're going to get in trouble when you're add, subtracting, multiplying, and dividing is if you're dividing by 0. So be careful that you're not dividing by 0. Make sure that that makes sense to you. At each step, why am I doing it? What am I doing? Do it yourself with the piece of paper. Okay? I know it's just up on the screen. Nevertheless, do it yourself. Okay? It's very different doing it yourself than watching someone do it. Then go through each and every step like that. Then go back, set all that aside, turn off the video, and try to do it yourself. You probably cannot. Then go back and look at the step where you get lost and go through the video again. Do that a few times. Then take out the tutorial assignment and do the same thing, watching the video, but doing the steps on your tutorial assignment, not on my problem, and see if you can do each of those steps, if you can see how those steps are the same between the two of those. And I think if you give yourself time to do this and realize that each step is a thinking process and it's not just obvious, right? If it's not obvious to you, it means it's not obvious to you. You've got to learn it. And so if you take the time to do that, spend your 2 to 3 hours going through the video slowly and thinking about each step, not just sort of repeating it by rote, but why is that? What is he doing? What is he adding to both sides? What is he subtracting from both sides? What is he multiplying both sides by? What is he dividing both sides by? And why for each step, then you will be good to go. Right? And then it will be easy for you too, and then you'll say, what was the problem? That's the hope. Right? That's the hope. But I think this is the way to approach it, and I think that where people run into trouble is partly the phobia, because bad experiences in the past, and partly this assumption that it's easy. It is not easy. It is easy for me because I've been doing it for 30 years. But it is not easy to learn anything. And if you don't know it yet, you should expect it to take a little time to know it, and then it will be easy for you too. Okay. Questions about that? Okay. So we're back to money. Right? This is our last class that is covered in the exam material. And we are on page 11. All right, let's try to click through all of this. Let's go to 11. That's the thing. The history of money. We're talking about the history of money. We talked about commodity money right, back in the day, stuff that's actually usable. We talked to the switch to metallic money, debasing the currency, seigniorage, and we got to banknotes. And banknotes are our first sort of modern-looking money. And these are notes that a bank writes just to say, bring this note to the bank, we'll give you money. And money still being the coins, right? And this is so much more convenient. And it turns out to be money in its own right. It wasn't intended to be that. But in the end, people start swapping these notes around rather than carrying the coins. And so two people that have nothing to do with AIB are still swapping around AIB notes to buy stuff. They're serving as a medium of exchange. Okay. Now, governments get involved in this fairly quickly because this is an innovation that comes just from commercial banks, but it is a super useful one because it's so much easier to carry the pieces of paper around than it is to carry the coins. You may know yourself, if you have a coin jar in the house, you say, okay, there's a lot of money in the coin jar, but it's such a pain to spend, and so you don't, and it just collects the coins there, right? Because the notes are so much easier to spend. This was true back in the day as well. Right. So governments get involved in this. They say, this is a very useful thing. Let's do the same thing. And so they print little slips of paper that say, for example, this note is worth £1 of sterling silver. This is where your pound sterling comes from. Just a little note that says, you bring this to the Bank of England, they will give you a pound of silver if you bring it in. Okay? And then the government is involved in this, and then the government is guaranteeing that the metal is there if you bring in the note. But it's the same thing the banks were doing, it's just we just get rid of the commercial banks. Okay? So when people say, I want to be paid in bank notes, this is what they mean now. And it came from really this history of the commercial banks coming up with it. We just sort of kept the name. And it's a lot of 30s movies. They're always getting things in bank notes, right? Gangster movies. So the government sort of pushes the banks out of this because it's obviously nicer to have a government-issued one rather than your local commercial bank because, of course, everyone's going to accept the government one, and maybe not everyone accepts the commercial bank one, right? But you'll notice if you go to Northern Ireland that their pound sterling, they still have the commercial bank's labels on it. They'll have Ulster Bank, little logo right there on the note. And this is not that the commercial banks are really involved in any meaningful way in this anymore. It's just a historical leftover, right? The UK loves to keep all their historical relics from the past, and this is one of them that they've kept, the commercial banks sticking their name on the banknotes. They didn't keep it for everywhere, though. Kept it for Northern Ireland. I'm not sure about Scotland. But anyway, Northern Ireland's got that. But it's just a holdover. Okay? So that's where our paper money comes from. And then everyone's using paper money. What do we got next? And this is what we're calling the gold standard. And the gold standard is not that it's the best, although it is used that way very often. Why is this not following me? But that that this money is backed by gold, so that when you have a note, you have your little note, you're actually thinking in terms of gold, or in the UK's case, silver, but in terms of a metallic money, which is not necessarily metal, as we know. So you're thinking in terms of the gold, you're not thinking in terms of paper. It's just that the paper is a stand-in for the gold, which is nice because it's easier to carry. easier to deal with than gold, right? And so, but it's okay because you're really dealing in gold the whole time. So the money didn't change. We just had these little notes to make it more convenient. Okay? But you know that if you want the gold, no problem, bring it into the Bank of England. They'll give you your gold. And if you got gold and you want it in little slips of paper, you can bring the gold into the Bank of England, and they'll give you the little slips of paper. Now, of course, most of us wouldn't go off to the central bank of the country to do this. We wouldn't go to the Bank of England because we were still in England in the day. All right? We would go to our local bank, and they would do it. They would give us the slips of paper. But then they would take the gold and they'd ship it off to the Bank of England, and Bank of England would give them slips of paper. So it's really, we'd have middlemen involved, but in fact, it was the Bank of England, in our case, doing this. It was the central bank doing all this. In some places, this was like very normal, and this is what all the countries did because it's super convenient to use the paper money. But it has a few downsides, and this is downsides of metallic money in general, is that the amount of money that's in the economy is very dependent on the amount of this metal that's in the economy. Right? So if we're on a gold standard, the amount of gold that's in the economy determines how much money there is, because the deal is if you bring gold to the central bank, they'll give you one of these slips of paper. And so the number of slips of paper out there in the world just depends on how much gold people bring in. Okay? And that has good sides and bad sides. The good side is that in principle, assuming that we don't have the debasing of the currency, we know what's in one of these things. Especially when they wrote the note, said this is worth £1 sterling. You say, well, I want it really sterling. I don't want it in any base metals in it. That's the deal, right? So that's nice. But sometimes it's going to turn out, and you haven't seen this, but sometimes you're going to want to increase the money supply. You can imagine, for example, if the economy is growing over time. That is, we have more people, and each person is more productive. There's just way more stuff being transacted. But if we had the same number of slips of paper, that means that the price of everything would have to be going down, right? Because we've got 10 pounds out there, and we used to have 10 things. That was £1 per thing. But now we've got 20 things out there. Now it has to be 50 pence per thing, right? Because there's only so many slips of paper. And if we have more stuff, each thing has to be worth less slips of paper. But prices going down is really problematic because prices, remember, involves all the prices in the economy. For example, it involves the price of labor. So it means your wage is going to be cut every year. And people really, really don't like that for a number of reasons, even though, in real terms, buying power might be the same. They don't like it because companies are always trying to slash our wages, right? It's not, you can't trust them. And so all of a sudden, yeah, it's just the economy. Sure, it's just the economy. You bastard. But anyway, it creates conflict. So it's very hard to lower wages. And this involves at some points when the economy is growing and the amount of gold in the economy isn't, that prices would have to be cut. And then, of course, occasionally you'd have situations where gold gets found somewhere. And then all of a sudden, tons of gold fall in. So this happened in the U.S. in the 49ers, back in the 1849. They found gold in the U.S. and all of a sudden in California, and all of a sudden there was gold everywhere, and it was a problem. You got inflation. It also happened in Europe earlier when the Portuguese and the Spanish started doing strip mining of South America to get all the gold. This was a problem as well. You got inflation. So you don't have control of these things, right? And this is a problem. Now, one of the advantages, of course, that you don't have control of these things, and maybe you're misusing your control, right, for seniorage purposes. But you don't have control of these things. That can be a problem. So just to sort of give you an idea that this is, even back in the day, was not uncontroversial, there was a movement, for example, in the U.S. in particular, it was a thing, but it was also elsewhere, that poor people wanted there to be more inflation, right? That they wanted prices to go up. In fact, prices were going down in that time, right? So prices were going down because the economy was growing, and yet the amount of gold was staying stable. So they wanted there to be sort of more money printed, and the way they thought about doing that is instead of just using gold, let's use gold and silver, two metals, the bimetallism thing. And we'd have a conversion between them, and that would allow us to have more gold. It's basically saying that we need some inflation. Right, that inflation would, in this case, they were thinking it would transfer money from the cities wealth from the cities to agricultural areas. And this guy, William Jennings Bryan, had a great speech at the convention, I think the Democratic convention, and he got nominated. He's like a very populist guy. He's also famous for the movie Inherit the Wind. He was the lawyer arguing for you shouldn't be allowed to teach evolution in schools. Good guy. Take it aside. He's a fun guy to read his speeches, though. But it was like a huge thing. Like on the strength of this argument, he gets into, this sort of outsider weirdo gets into the presidential nomination and all of this. So don't think it wasn't controversial, is the point there. Bimetallism in and of itself, from an economic point of view, not particularly interesting. But this fact that having the gold standard really tied your hands, and sometimes you want to do something useful with your hands, and you want to have a little inflation, or you want to have less deflation. You can't do that because the amount of gold and the amount of money in the system is tied to the amount of gold that's out there, and it's not under your control. Okay? It's got good sides to that because you're not going to misuse your control, but it's got bad sides because you can't do anything with your control. Okay, then along comes World War I. And the thing that happens in every war, of course, is that countries want money. They got lots of expenses. They got very little tax revenue because they've sent everyone off to war. And so what are they going to do? And so since the dawn of time, what they do is they print money, right? Debasing the currency. And so when World War I comes along, countries in particular are really desperate for money. And so all the countries suspend the gold standard. They say, it's true that we said it was a pound of silver for every slip of paper, but we're not doing that anymore. It's just slips of paper, but don't worry, it's just temporary, just till we win the war. Okay? And so all the countries go off the gold standard. Okay? They're very worried about this because what's to stop you from just printing ridiculous amounts of money and then having super inflation? But they all do this. And then as soon as the war is over, all the countries, except one, all the countries go immediately back to the gold standard. Now, they've printed loads of money during this period, and so your pound sterling is no longer worth a pound of sterling silver. There's get a fraction of that, but at least it's backed by silver, right? And so you can get a certain amount of silver. It's not the pound you were promised originally, but there was a war on. Like be patriotic, for God's sake. So people are okay with that. We're back on the thing, and now the money is stable and everything's good, except for Germany. And Germany has a bigger problem. Germany has the problem that at the end of the war, they have the Treaty of Versailles, and in the Treaty of Versailles, the Allies say, bad country, no biscuit, you have to owe us tons of money for the foreseeable future. Famously, our Keynes, Mr. John Maynard Keynes, he's from an aristocratic kind of family. And so he was well-connected, and he was like a genius at birth and all that. And so he was put on the committee. He was like a little baby economist. And he was sent out to the committee to be part of the Treaty of Versailles. But he was the junior guy. He was the guy that was carrying the big guy's briefcases. So he was in the room, but he was told not to talk, so he didn't talk. Right? And so he was the briefcase carrier during this whole thing. I think he was 19 or 20, something like that. And so he was in the room, Treaty of Versailles, comes out of the thing and writes a book called The Economic Consequences of the Peace. And his argument in that book, it's a little book, he says, we have put such onerous reparations on Germany that there's no way they can afford to pay them. And so in order to pay them, they're going to have to run hyperinflation. They're going to have to just keep printing money in order to pay what they owe us. And they're going to print so much money, it's going to result in a hyperinflation. The hyperinflation will lead to the breakdown of society, and therefore will lead to a rise of a dictator, and the seeds of a new world war will be started. Okay? Total fiction, could never happen. But anyway, it got published, who knows. And of course this comes to pass, right? And we have that thing. So Germany has to pay loads and loads of money. They start printing money. They don't go back on the gold standard because they have all of these debts and they have to pay them. Easiest way to pay them is to print extra money. They can't do that on the gold standard because they have to have a certain amount of gold in the vault to print the money. So they don't go back on the gold standard. And they start printing money like there's no tomorrow. And so at some point it gets to the point where you can wallpaper your house with money cheaper than buying the actual wallpaper. But people have their rooms done in money. Workers would get paid 3 times a day. They would take a wheelbarrow full of money out on break 1 and buy stuff. And they had to be paid 3 times a day because if you waited till the end of the day to pay them, their wages were worth so little that it wasn't worth working. So the inflation between morning and afternoon was so high that they had to be paid multiple times, and they all would rush out and spend it. So it was terrible. Like, it was a horrible, horrible time. Like, people's grandmothers, well, they weren't grandmothers at the time, but, grandmothers later on, they were destitute, people starved. It was, like, genuinely horrible, right? Because the financial system broke down. If you were on a pension, for example, that pension was basically worthless after a few years of this, and so there was nothing for you to eat. It was really genuinely bad, right? Factories went out of work because you just can't be paying people 3 times a day as a practical. Wheelbarrows full of money is not a practical way to run a society. Everything started reverting back to barter rather than having this money serving as a medium of exchange. And so lots of things that you can do, you can't do in a barter society. For example, economics lectures. I would starve in a barter society. Here I'm doing okay. So it's nice. I like the money. It's very good. So this was a real problem, this hyperinflation. And it's so much so that one of the main arguments for why Europe looks the way it is today is because the German society and people and culture have internalized the horribleness of what happened mid-war with the hyperinflation. We also internalized the horrible things that happened later, but this hyperinflation thing is important. Okay. So you look around the world at that stage. So we're of course, in the 30s, you see the rise of the dictator and all that, and it was unpleasant. There was some unpleasantness in the 40s, I've been told. And so, and of course, when we go into World War II, all the countries drop the gold standard once again, right? Because you have to print money. But as soon as the war is over, they want really quickly to go back to the gold standard, right? Because they looked around and they said, after World War I, during World War I, everyone left the gold standard, and then at the end of the war, everyone went back to the gold standard except for Germany. And that was a disaster, like really a disaster, a proper disaster. And so the lesson learned is, gold is money, money is gold. Don't be screwing around with this stuff that you just print. Like, there has to be a real something for our money to work. Otherwise, governments can't be trusted. They will just print money. You'll have a hyperinflation, breakdown of society, rise of the dictator, terrible things. Don't do it, right? So they're at the end of the war, and they say, okay, like, everyone's really clear. Gold standard is the way to go. This non-gold standard thing is horrible, right? This is zombie apocalypse kind of direction to go. We're not going that way. We're going back on the gold standard. But there's a problem. It turns out the war was very expensive. Who would have thought? And the only, not the only, but the big economy that was kind of running during all this time was the US. Right? And so during this time, all the gold of Europe, some of it went to Switzerland, just saying. But the rest of the gold of Europe went to, and the world, went to the US. Right? They were buying stuff. And so they would go and buy stuff with gold, and the US would send the stuff, and the US would get the gold, one way or another. And so basically, I think US had 80% of the world's gold at the end of the war, and the rest was in little bits and pieces, like governments didn't own it. It was just held by individuals and Swiss bankers. But the US basically had all the world's gold. And so England and Germany, they're both saying, okay, we need to go back on the gold standard. Right? We don't want the hyperinflation. We need to go back on the gold standard. But we ain't got no gold, and we don't have no silver, so what do we do? And so one thing that could have happened is the US could have said, that's a problem. Here, have some gold. But you may have noticed that people with big piles of gold aren't just handing it out willy-nilly, and the US was no different. And they did have the Marshall Plan, but they didn't give gold. They gave stuff because they wanted to support. Anyway, motives aside, they didn't give giant piles of gold for obvious reasons, right? You like to have your gold. What they did is they took all this gold and they stuck it in a place where it was safe. They thought someplace that has lots of guards, so maybe a military base. We'll stick it in some kind of fort. That's what they call the military base. They stuck it in Fort Knox. And this is where Fort Knox became a thing, because all the world's gold, 80%, was stuck in that military base, in basements and guards and whatnot. So that's where it becomes a thing after World War II. Okay, but now we have a problem. So they're not going to give all the gold back. So that's not on the table. But we do need to do something to stabilize the economy, because we don't want another interwar Germany situation going on. So what do we do? Well, what they did is, this was back in the day, right? Back in the day, you get your 5 guys in a room, and they star chamber, and they decide everything for all the people of all the world. They say, this country, all your people out. That country, get this, all those people. That's how they thought back in the day. And so they do that kind of thing. They get all of the finance ministers from, I think, 44 countries, but importantly, 5 countries. Right? The other guys were just sort of guests. And they say, let's all meet in a fancy resort. Let's meet in Bretton Woods. This is a resort in, I think, Vermont or one of these places, one of these seaside towns in the US. Big fancy place, shrimp buffet, lobster, caviar, the whole works. All the finance ministers go there, and they divide up the world, as they did back in the day. Right? And so their clever system for dividing up the world and making everything work right, and we're on the gold standard-ish again, is they say, what we're going to do is we're going to have this agreement, and the US will go on the gold standard. So $1 US will be worth so much gold. Okay? Great, US is on the gold standard. What about the rest of us? They say, well, we're not going to give you the gold to do it, because that's ridiculous. Have some shrimp. What they did instead is they said, what you'll do is you'll say the British pound is worth so many US dollars. And that way, if somebody says, I would like gold, they can take their British pound, they can give it to you, you'll give them dollars, they can take the dollars, give them to us, and we'll give them gold. So it's like Britain is on the gold standard, but it's not direct. It's indirect through the United States. Okay? So this is the idea. Now, of course, in order to do this, it requires the Americans to play along. They couldn't do this really easily on their own, because if someone comes and says, I want US dollars, they've got to have the US dollars, and they can't print them. They have to, they can have a certain amount in the vault, but if people want more than that, that's a problem, right? And so when they make an agreement with the Americans say, like, if it's like a one-time thing, no problem, we'll give you some dollars. We'll loan you some dollars. No giving. There's no giving involved. Well, there's an interest attached to it. But we'll make sure you have the dollars to pay those guys off, so everything's okay, right? And so they come to this agreement, and part of this agreement is you're not just going to start printing British pounds like there's no tomorrow. Right? You've got to keep your British pounds under control, otherwise we're out of the agreement and you can't do the conversion anymore. Okay? And in this is what they were looking for, right? They were looking for a way to tie their hands so they wouldn't print too many British pounds. Because they looked at the Germans printed way too many Deutschmarks, society fell apart. So, and the Germans looked at the Germans and said, we printed way too many Deutschmarks, we don't want that again. And so everyone's in agreement, we don't want that again, zombie apocalypse, not so great. And so they all tie their hands by this Bretton Woods agreement. Okay? What else we got here? Okay. So this is a form of fixed exchange rate. That is, the British pound is worth 4 US dollars, and the government just decides this is how much it's worth. Now you can do what you want. I'm saying it's worth 4, and if you want to trade amongst yourself at some different rate, that's fine. Suppose you require 5 US dollars for your British pound. Well, fine, but no one's going to buy it, because they can buy it for 4 from the central bank, right? And so if you charge a different price, you just got no buyers, because you're charging a different price, and they can get it for that price at the central bank. So by having this fixed exchange rate, they sort of have a de facto gold standard going through the Americans. Fixed exchange rates, by the way, are still occasionally popular today. They have problems. This is actually one of my areas of research, is how fixed exchange rates fall down in a crashing, burning slag mess. But they do happen from time to time. It's a topic for financial economics. International finance talks about that. Okay. Now, there was a problem. Do we have that? No, we don't. There was one problem with this, is they only had certain guys at the Bretton Woods Agreement, so not everyone in the world has agreed to this, just the big shots, right? And so they say, well, how do we keep all the little countries in line? It's all well and good that, you know, us big five and then the 40 other guys we decided to invite play along with this system. But what about all the other countries, which collectively had a lot of people in them and potentially could disrupt the whole thing, right? If there's hyperinflation somewhere and that society falls apart, who knows that you don't have another world war starting from there, right? So you want like the whole financial system of the world to be stable. And so they come up with a system to try to keep all the little guys in line. And that system is the IMF, the International Monetary Fund. And this is where the International Monetary Fund came from. They said, what's to get the other countries to play along? It's not that the US wants to like get into a deal with Bangladesh where they decide the Bangladesh how much money they can print, but we do want Bangladesh to behave, like to be stable. Right? It's good for them, it's good for us, it's good for everybody. Like be good. Like, a little paternalistic, but still good intentions there-ish. So how do you do that? Well, they start this International Monetary Fund, and they give it a big pile of money to start out with, and they say, go to the other countries and say, Bangladesh, if you behave financially, don't print too much money, other things, behave in like what we think is a paternalistically good way to behave financially. Okay? Sometimes wise, sometimes not so, but anyway, they're doing their best. Then Bangladesh, when things get hard, can borrow money from this pile of money. And so the incentive for Bangladesh to play along is, first of all, it might be good advice, might not. But if it's good advice, that's nice, and it gives them an excuse. They can say, you know, I know we want to do this thing, but they don't really. But they can blame it on the IMF. So that's nice, right? And then the carrot part of it is, look, if you behave, if you do the thing that we want you to do, then when things get hard, you can borrow from this pot of money. And so that's nice. And so maybe these countries will play along. And that is the sole reason the IMF was created. That's why it exists in the world. Okay. How are we doing? Okay. So there we are. We're going along. Everything's fine until the US gets into Vietnam. Slowly, without really thinking too much about it. And along with Lyndon Johnson doing all kinds of social problems. And it is a war. Nobody thought it was going to be. Well, everybody except the politicians thought it was going to be. But the politicians didn't think it was going to be a war, but it escalates and so on. And all of a sudden, they're talking real money. And they've also committed to all these other programs. And they have lots of need for money and not so easy way to raise the money. And so like countries everywhere that are in a war, they want to debase the currency. They want to print more money, but they're on the gold standard, so their hands are tied. So in 1972, out of the blue, Nixon gets up on the wrong side of the bed, makes a speech and says, we're no longer on the gold standard. And that is it. The Bretton Woods Agreement is over because the Bretton Woods Agreement was all based on the US is going to be on the gold standard and we're all going to tie ourselves to the US, right? But now the US isn't on the gold standard, so all that bets are off. And now places, particularly like Germany, say, well, the whole reason we're willing to do this thing where we're relating to the US dollar is so that we don't have the hyperinflation like we had before. But in fact, we don't want it in and of it ourselves. And now the Americans are doing goofy things with this Vietnam War, and they're spending money like there's no tomorrow. Like we would prefer to be tied to anyone else but them, because look, they're problem children. They're going to get us into trouble if we tie ourselves to them, right? Just like your mom said, don't hang out with them. They're going to lead you to trouble. It's the same deal exactly. And so the Bretton Woods system is over just like that. Okay? One day, Nixon wakes up, it's over. I'm not sure they had meetings. Probably they had meetings and discussed it, but it was all secret. For the world's point of view, it was pretty sudden and, what the hell? Now, I cannot emphasize to you how big a deal this was. Now, for normal people running their normal lives, it's not a big deal. It's just, okay, there's a goofy thing that the powers that be did, and you're right to say that. But in terms of your economists and your pontificating classes, it's a huge deal. Like never before in the history of the world had anything like this happened. We have moved from the gold standard in one crazy form or another, and we've moved to what's called fiat money. Fiat money is just money because someone said so. There's no other reason for it to be money. Just by, you hear about judicial fiat. The judge just decided, now we all have to do it. It's the same thing. We just said it's money, therefore it's money. Okay? And that's the money that we all know and love, that we all grew up with. Ever since 72, that's the way the world works. But it was only like that outside of wartime once before in major economy human history, and that was Germany in the 20s and 30s. And it did not go well. And so this is like a big, big, big deal that freaked everybody out because inflation, hyperinflation, people out of work, grannies starving, rise of a dictator, world war, all of that is bad. And so that's our only experience in a world of having this kind of money, right? Having money just be basically monopoly money. If you accept it, because you accept it. But if you don't want to accept it, you don't, because it's just made up. Right? Someone just said, this is money. Have at it. Right? You can buy it or not. So this was a big deal. Right? And it's only been since 1972. Right? So that's what, 50 years, like almost exactly 50 years now, that the world is run this way. It never was run successfully this way before. It never even really seriously tried. And now we got this fiat money. And if you think about it in terms of the whole sweep of human histories, it's kind of early days yet to know whether it's going to work or not. And we all pretend like it's normal and this is just the way we live. And that's fine. And so far, so good. With a few ups and downs. But really, it's early days. Right? For example, we have not gone through a major world war yet with this kind of money. Right? We just haven't lived that kind of experience. Like, hopefully we don't, but they happened before. So, all right. So we got the fiat money. And of course, Europe freaks out about this because, they trusted those guys. What were they thinking? Right? Those guys said they were going to be on the gold standard, and now, poof, gone. And of course, the American point of view is we're just finishing up your dumb war in Vietnam. You started it, okay. Anyway, we're all not getting along. And so we create the European monetary system. And this is our way of trying to have a stable system in Europe. I say ours like I'm European. Isn't that cute? Our way of doing this kind of thing, of trying to stabilize things, given the fact that we don't have the giant pile of gold. Right? Ideally, from the point of view of sort of economists of the day, we would go back on the gold standard of some sort. But we don't have the gold to do that, so we got to do something else, and we come up with this European monetary system, which was a goofball system. It was absolutely bonkers. There's so many details and weirdnesses about the European monetary system, I cannot even start. But let me just give you a flavor of it. So what they do is they say, okay, we cannot tie ourselves to gold the way we did before, but what we can do is tie ourselves to each other. And so they say, 1 British pound is going to be worth so many Deutschmarks. I don't know what it was, 5, say. 5 Deutschmarks. And that's going to be worth so many francs, and so on. Right? And then we're going to think of that sort of as a monetary unit. So they come up with this European currency unit. And this European currency unit is they take a basket, a metaphorical basket, but you could do it in a real basket, and they put in so many Deutschmarks, they put in so many pounds. They have this basket of money, and they say, how much would you pay for this basket of money? And all the countries had to adjust their money supply, the amount of money that they print, so that the price of their money fell within so close to the 5 Deutschmarks it was supposed to be. So the British had to keep adjusting the amount of pounds that they had so that it was more or less 5 Deutschmarks. And all the newspapers would print the price of this European currency unit everywhere. Loads of people, it was in the 90s, all my friends who wanted to work at the IMF were all studying the European currency unit and what happened with that. And so that sort of limped along for 20 years. It had worked okay until it didn't, and then there was a crisis, and all the finance ministers would meet, and they'd readjust all the numbers. Then it would work okay until it didn't, and then they'd readjust all the numbers again. But they sort of limped along with this thing until 1992. And in 1992, it was kind of like you could see that its days were numbered. That is, at the very beginning, they said it was 5 Deutschmarks to a British pound, and now they're saying it's somewhere between 3 and 10 Deutschmarks per British. So they're widening the amount that it can play around because they can't control it that well. Doing their best, but it's clearly not going to be around in 1,000 years, right? It's clearly that kind of thing. And so in 1992, there was a speculative attack on the British pound. Actually, there was a speculative attack on the Swedish krona. What's krona, you guys? Any Swedes? Krona? Is that right? I don't know. The Swedish money. I'm thinking krona. And so that was fixed to the EQ. So suppose it was like 7 krona per Deutschmark, or whatever it was, right? And then people thought that it was going to devalue. So today it's worth 7 krona per Deutschmark. Tomorrow it's going to be 14 krona per Deutschmark, right? So what everyone did is they took their krona, they converted them into Deutschmarks at 7, hoping that the next day they could convert them back at 14 and double their money overnight. Everyone did this all at once. Now, in fact, they did it so much all at once, and by everyone I mean the big banks and big investors, not like humans, but the big money guys. They did this all at once. And to do this, they were borrowing money. So they borrowed tons of money in Swedish krona. They switched them into Deutschmarks, so they're paying huge interest, and they're hoping that there's a devaluation so they can double their money overnight. Right? This is their goal. And the interbank interest rate at one point was 500% per year. So they're paying a cost of 500% per year to borrow this money. Just for a couple days, but still, it's real money. And then they gave up because they're just paying so much in interest, and then it went away. Okay? And so they lost a bunch of money, and that was that. Then a few months later, the exact same thing happens in the UK. And so all these investor guys, they start borrowing money to buy Deutschmarks. So they think today it's going to be 5 Deutschmarks per pound, and tomorrow it's going to be 10 Deutschmarks per pound. So you're going to double your money overnight, right? So they're all borrowing money in British pounds, switching them into Deutschmarks. And the governor of the central bank, Bank of England, he comes out and says, this will never work. We will always defend the British pound. We will do anything to defend the British pound. And this is where George Soros becomes famous and also really super rich. Like, he was plenty rich to begin with. Well, not to begin with. He started poor. But he was plenty rich at that stage of his life. And he had bought a lot of Deutschmarks. Like, he converted basically all his assets into Deutschmarks to do this kind of scam. But then the governor of the Bank of England comes out and makes this strong statement. And his reasoning was, okay, it's a strong statement, but he wouldn't make this statement if he wasn't scared. And so the fact that he had to come out on the steps means that he is going to devalue. And so all of a sudden he goes out and he borrows everything he can. And not just him, but loads of other people too. They borrow everything they can, and within 24 hours, the central bank gives up and they devalue the currency and they leave the European monetary system. Effectively, they're still officially in it, but the basically European monetary system ceases to be an effective anything. Which is one of the interesting things to get out of this episode is that, now we had the question, like, should policymakers lie? And one of the things I didn't tell the guys to discuss with you is, like, is the lying effective? Right? This guy, he might even believed it when he said it, but the fact that he was saying it signals something different. So this managing people's expectations is not as easy as you would think, right? People can not only look at your words, but infer things from the fact that you're talking at all. It's unclear how to do this well. And it's something that central bankers worry a lot about. And their basic solution is never to actually say anything. That's not what they claim their solution is, but listen to them. They say nothing. Like, what's his name? The previous American central banker. He was amazing. You could just watch him, and he would go on and on for 2 hours, and every single second you thought he was saying something. But then you come back at the end. What did he say? Nothing. He said nothing for 2 hours in such a authoritative, knowledgeable kind of way, but nothing got said. It was impressive. And a friend of mine was the governor of the Turkish central bank for a while. And like, by the time we saw him at the end, he was so good at that you couldn't talk to him at a party because he'd say nothing. Like, there's nothing he'll say. Like, he's very careful about how he talks because anything you can say, anything you might say, even like a joke, can be misinterpreted and the whole markets can crash and rise. And so you have to be very circumspect. How are we doing? 5 minutes. All right, so that was the European monetary system, died in 1992. And since then, Europe has been on a pure fiat money system. We are just, money is just slips of paper. You accept money because you think other people will accept the money in return. And they accept money because they think other people will accept the money in return. It is really, genuinely a Tinkerbell situation. If we believe in fairies, there will be fairies. If we don't believe in fairies, they will die. And that's the deal. If you don't believe that this money is going to be accepted by other people, you won't accept it yourself, right? Because you want to buy stuff. And so, because before you could say, well, if they don't accept it, I'll just turn it into gold, and gold is real. But you still have to accept the gold. But it felt more real. But now it is just because you think other people will accept it. There is no other reason to accept money. And then, of course, we got the euro. Oh, look, perfect timing in the history of money. We got to the euro, which is just Europe coming together and say, let's have one fiat currency ourselves. Just to mention the euro, in that when it was introduced, there was really serious worry that people wouldn't accept it, right? Because you could say, okay, we have this whole history with the British pound, right? And people continue to accept the British pound just because they grew up with the British pound, right? And they're not like clued in to know that we're not on the gold standard anymore or anything like that. But their grandmother used the British pound, their mother used the British pound. They're going to continue to use the British pound. For God's sake, it's got the Queen on it. What more do you want? And so that's going to be fine. But when we go to the euro, this is a whole brand new thing. There's no reason people had to accept it or use it, right? And so they were very, very, very worried that people wouldn't accept it. So they had a huge advertising campaign. They had politicians walking out in front of fireworks. They built the world's biggest letters to write euro across the thing. They did all the advertising trickery that they could think of to try to make it seem like it's a valuable thing. And one of the things they did is that their original plan was it was going to be about €1 per US dollar. But when they introduced it, they thought, well, what if it doesn't do well and falls? Right? And people aren't using it. So they said, let's start it out about 1.3. I can't remember the number they started out. $1.3 per euro. So that if it falls 30%, it still looks okay compared to the US dollar. Because they were so worried that it was just going to tank on the start and that no one would accept the thing. Okay. And what I want to say about the European Central Bank. Well, we don't know what a central bank is, but part of the moving to the euro meant that so for Ireland had a central bank, and our central bank's job is to control how much money is in the economy, and we'll see the mechanism by which they do that. But now we're on euro, we aren't controlling how many Irish pounds are out there, because there's no Irish pounds. The amount of euros that are out there are decided by the European Central Bank, the ECB, which is off in Frankfurt. Okay? Not in Brussels, by the way. Everyone moved it to Frankfurt, which is a bit odd, isn't it? Like every other European institution is elsewhere. But the central bank is in Frankfurt. Why is that? Well, it's because of the interwar thing where they had the hyperinflation, and the Germans are like super paranoid about inflation. And so they did not want to give up control of this institution that could lead their grandmothers to starving in the street once again. Right? Hitler was a bad scene, and they don't want any part of that. And so they were very worried about that. And for the other part, the other countries in the European Union were actually worried that this thing wouldn't work as well, right? And so they were quite willing to put up a little fight, but they weren't all that reluctant to let Germany have more than its share of control over the European Central Bank because they wanted something stable. And they thought Germany as a set of institutions and sort of a mindset to inflation would keep a more stable currency than, say, for example, Italy. Okay, I'll let you go. That, by the way, is everything that's on the exam. On Friday, bring questions. Come with loads and loads of questions so I don't have to lecture you about anything.